The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. This is Jack Rogers, Editor-in-Chief of Business Facilities Magazine. I'm coming to you from my home in Wayne Township, New Jersey. I want to welcome everyone to the first presentation of Business Facilities LiveXchange webinar series. And we're going to answer the question, are we ready for the drone age? Before we get started, I know that everyone who's listening today wants us to take a moment to express our gratitude to America's healthcare workers who continue to wage a courageous and determined fight on the front lines against COVID-19. We thank all of these heroes. We also want to thank all of the attendees for this year's virtual LiveXchange event for their help in transitioning our annual event to a virtual venue this year. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. You'll see the control panel on your screen. You can use the question box to submit questions. You can send questions in at any time during the presentation, and we will try to answer as many as time permits. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of the control panel that either expands or collapses the control panel. And to have access to the question box, you have to expand it. If you have any technical difficulties, just send us a message in the question section and someone on our team will answer you privately. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. Mark Blanks is one of the nation's leading experts on unmanned aerial systems, also known as drones. Mark is the director of the Virginia Tech Mid-Atlantic Aviation Partnership, which is also known by its acronym MAP, where he leads both an FAA-designated drone test site and the Unmanned Aerial System Integration Pilot Program, also known as IPP. Mark has built successful drone research programs at several universities, leveraging his extensive background in aircraft maintenance, flight test, and certification. At Virginia Tech, he has guided MAP through rapid growth while overseeing and expanding a substantial portfolio of operations and research. Mark plays an active role in policy and advocacy, serving on multiple UAS systems-related boards and committees. He is an instrument-rated pilot and aircraft mechanic. Mark is going to give us a brief update of the ongoing effort to safely integrate unmanned aerial systems into commercial airspace, and then we'll take some questions. So without further ado, let's get started. Good morning, Mark.
Morning, Jack. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today. So I'm going to walk through a presentation to kind of talk about what we do and what's the industry's been doing, the drone industry or the unmanned aircraft industry. I use those terms interchangeably, and talk through some of the issues we've had and ones we currently face and where we're headed to, and hopefully we can answer this question about whether or not we're ready for the drone age. So without further ado, though, I'll get started. Just to real quick describe who we are. As Jack mentioned, we are the Mid-Atlantic Aviation Partnership, or MAP. What that is we're part of Virginia Tech, we're part of the university, but we are also hold two different designations from the FAA. One is we're an FAA Unmanned Aircraft Systems test site. There's 7 of those. That's what the map on the left side shows. We're also an FAA UAS Integration Pilot Program, which is a slightly different program, which we'll talk about here in a second. You can see from this map, there's only 3 states that are both of these: Virginia, North Dakota, and Alaska. So we're very fortunate, very pleased to participate in both programs. So on the test site side, what that really is, and I love this picture of crashing drones into a dummy because it shows what we do. We test open-ended concepts, so it could be almost anything. People come to us with new technologies or new ideas, and we put those through the paces in different ways. We've done a lot of work in injury risk, understanding what is the injury risk, as an example, what's just shown here in this picture. But it's really, we can work with anybody there. The Integration Pilot Program, or the IPP, is a different program where the FAA basically selected several high impact projects and focused on implementing those into local communities so that we could understand the role of state and local government. So for us, we have 3 specific projects. One is doing package delivery with a company called Wing, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet, as well as doing damage assessment with State Farm, and then linear infrastructure inspection with Dominion Energy. And so they're different.
Mark, excuse me. Alphabet is the parent company of Google, correct?
Correct, it is, Jack. Yep.
Just wanted to get that in. Thanks.
Certainly. So actually, in the picture you see on the right side, there is Wings aircraft delivering a package. That actually happens to be my house. This one doesn't have my kids in it, but delivering packages to houses, and that's actually happening right now here in Christiansburg, Virginia. It's the only residential drone delivery program in the country that's ongoing. So that's the two basic programs. But kind of what else do? We also do a lot of different testing. As I mentioned, under the test site, we are trying out all kinds of different things. And this series of pictures shows just some of what those are. I've already talked briefly about the injury risk and about package delivery, but we also test onboard sensors. The aircraft in the middle at the top is flying an onboard radar to see other drones and other manned aircraft. The bottom right picture of the tower is a ground-based radar used to surveil airspace and avoid other aircraft. And on the bottom there, we're flying a drone on transmission power lines in central Virginia, testing out basically communications between that aircraft and the ground. Well, let's talk about the industry. We're not here to talk primarily about MAP, so we're gonna talk more generally, and then hopefully answer some questions that are more specific. So first of all, we have come a long ways, and I've been in this industry for about 10 years, a little over 10 years now, and it's been amazing to watch the progression. We've gone from very, very, I guess, cobbled together, home-built, hobbyist type systems, that are based on things that are built in a garage, really, all the way to professional, I would still call them commercial grade, off-the-shelf systems that are designed to be very high performance, very reliable. It's changed dramatically. And in this picture here, all these are designed to do the same thing, fly a camera in this case. But you see a progression on the screen from basically home built to a off-the-shelf 6-figure aircraft designed with thermal cameras and other things to do inspections of power lines. So as far as that goes, the technology's progressed, but we also have to have regulations that allow things to fly and do their jobs and make money and be commercial. And the rules that came out in 2016 that enabled that was Part 107. Part 107 is a part of the Federal Aviation Regulations, and it was the rule that basically opened the door for making money or revenue operating for commercial hire with drones. And so that really started the commercial industry, or kickstarted it. It was already kind of in existence before, but not really in the US until this rule came out. And so many, many companies spawned after this, and we really began to tap the possibilities of what drones can do. Part 107 was quite unique, though. It was a very different approach for the FAA. They basically said, if you fly within these limitations, you can do whatever you want. However, those limitations, are somewhat of a challenge. Specifically, the aircraft has to be flown visual line of sight, meaning that the pilot can see where the aircraft is at. Cannot fly over people, cannot fly at night, cannot fly multiple aircraft at the same time with one pilot. There was a number of rules there, but the real safety mitigation is flying visual line of sight only and not flying over people. But the real benefit of drones really comes when you can go beyond line of sight, when you can go that long distance down a power line. If I'm stuck where I can only see the aircraft, it really doesn't allow me to reach the full potential of the technology. So I like to say that this basically just whet the appetite of the market. We've been there in this place since 2016. The FAA did build in the ability to do waivers for Part 107, or the ability to gain approvals that go beyond it on an individual case-by-case basis. And that's where we've been at for quite some time, is just doing case-by-case approvals along the way. So what's holding the industry back is really the question. And what I'm going to talk through now are some of the high-level concepts that have kept us from realizing that full potential, and then talk through some of the things that are the progress that's being made on each of those items. So first of all, technology maturity, and this is one that perhaps the drone industry may not like for us to talk about in some cases. Really, we've seen, especially the test site, where we are testing things day in and day out, that a lot of times the nascent, when I call it pre-certification, meaning it's not proven technology yet, has some challenges. We've seen challenges with reliability and performance. They don't always do what they say they're going to do, or they didn't used to. And we've seen throughout the years that the technology was lacking in maturity. However, that's been changing, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But technology is only really one side of this, even though people get stuck on it a lot. Perhaps just as important is the professionalism in flight operations. I use the term operational maturity a lot of times, but perhaps professionalism is easier to capture. People often see drones as toys. They can go down to the Walmart or to Best Buy and pick up a drone and go out and fly it and treat it like it's just some other device, some other electronic device they purchased. But you have to realize that aircraft is flying in the national airspace system. It's flying up there with other manned aircraft flying around. And the risks are very different when you're in the air. You can't just pull over to the side of the road like you can with a car. And if you have a problem, the results can be significant. So professionalism is, we have had this lack of a safety culture in the drone industry. Typical manned aviators understand that their life is on the line. They're in the aircraft, and they have a very safety culture built into their mentality of everything that they do. But we hadn't seen that, or did not see that earlier in the industry. It was much more of a casual attitude. And still, the concerns I hear about a lot from people who are anti-drone is about this fact. They have a neighbor, they know someone who's behaved very unprofessional with a drone operation. So that's been another major thing holding us back. But beyond that, there's also the need for specific safety requirements. And when I'm talking about safety requirements, what I mean is basically the regulator, in this case the FAA, telling us how safe does it need to be? What does it need to be able to do? What is the level of risk that is acceptable and not acceptable? There was not a good understanding of what the data was that would show that something was safe or not safe. So the imagery you see here is another one of these examples of injury testing. So there was if you want to operate over people, we didn't know what the bar was. How safe did it have to be? And there's basically two ways, just for that as an example, there's two ways to address it. One is the aircraft never ever falls out of the sky. It's 100% reliable, or 99.99% reliable. Or the other option is you make the drone out of materials and shapes or concepts, structure, where it won't hurt someone if it did hit them. So let's just say you don't assume it will never fall out of the sky. You instead make it so that it's safe even if it does fall out of the sky. But we didn't have the data to prove what either point were. So safety requirements was another issue. But the one that we certainly cannot overlook is public perception. So when I first got into this industry in 2009, everybody that said drone immediately thought of Predator drones flying over in the Middle East dropping bombs. It was very much a military context. Now it's a DJI Phantom or other hobbyist drone. There's been a significant shift of what the connotation and the perception of what drones are in the past 10 years. But at the end of the day, for commercial drones especially, to be useful and to be used and to grow, we have to have a public perception that is positive of that, because otherwise, basically the services that those provide will not be utilized by the public. And so it actually behooves the industry to have a very positive experience with the communities, because public perception basically drives the demand for the technology. So at the start of this, past decade, there was really a lack of familiarity of what was going on with drones. Why are they there? What are the benefits versus all the negative potential consequences? And so there was a lot of public anxiety. So that's 4 different areas where I feel like we've been held back as an industry. But we're also at a turning point now, and this is where I like to say that drones are growing up. And in this case, they really are in many ways. So I'm going to walk through these just to explain how we've been addressing each of those as we come into this potential drone age. First of all, And we talked earlier about technology maturity, and that they were not necessarily reliable. They wouldn't do what they said they were going to do, or we had issues with the technology. But we've actually, in the past several years, been able to prove the reliability and safety of specific aircraft and of specific designs. We now have data that proves that they can be reliable and not fall out of the sky, or also that they are not going to hurt people, or both together. What that data has led to is some very groundbreaking national approvals. One of the examples in this picture here is a company we work with. This is State Farm, flying the SenseFly EB Classic, is the name of the aircraft. We work with State Farm and the FAA to spend about a year and a half of collecting data about the safety of this design for them to use it in doing damage assessment after a hurricane or a hailstorm. And they were able to receive a national approval to do exactly that, to go basically anywhere in the country after a major damage event and fly over people and beyond line of sight to do that because the operation had been proved safe. We also have new major approvals about drone delivery, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and a process for how we're going to do this in the future. And additionally, the FAA has now created a program for certifying unmanned aircraft, and that's certifying the technology to prove that it's safe. And so there is, even as of last week, the FAA published an approved policy for how they will certify drones, which is quite groundbreaking because they've been keeping everything only under the manned aircraft structure before. Additionally, as I mentioned, professionalism in operations or operational maturity, we are seeing much more mature operations than we had before. The best example of this is really the air carrier certificate. So what an air carrier is basically the approval of the operation. So the FAA will certify the technology. They will also certify a pilot, and then they can also certify an entire organization as an air carrier. This is the same way that airlines are certified, and charter jets and medevac helicopters, and all those are certified through the same process. And essentially what this involves is the FAA reviewing every detail about the program, how the aircraft are maintained, how they're operated, how they handle incidents or accidents, what weather conditions they can fly in, what routes they can fly. It's every single aspect you can think of about the flights. And they approve that whole operation itself as safe. And there's a lot of many companies over the years in manned aviation that receive these air carrier certificates. In this case, in the past over a year now, we have 3 new air carriers that are specific to drones or UAS. The first was Wing, working here in Christiansburg. In April 21st last year, they received an approval for an air carrier to do package delivery. And then in September, UPS received a similar approval. And then just in the past month, Amazon received their approval. And so the operations you see in this picture here, delivering packages to a residential house, is now approved under the FAA's air carrier program. And this is really a huge shift towards seeing drone operations in a very similar manner to manned aviation or normal aviation. The entire operation, aircraft, everything is certified and approved for flight and pilots as well. So that's a big shift from the hobbyist or toy type mentality, especially in the commercial market, to a fully approved operation. Additionally, as far as safety goes, what are the safety requirements? What is the data needed? The FAA has recently published 2 new proposed rules. This is an operations over people. NPRM means a notice of proposed rulemaking. So this is where the FAA puts out a draft rule and asks the public to comment on them. And they leave those open for 60 to 90 days. The public comments on them, and then they go back and they adjudicate or they consider all those comments, and then they will publish a final rule. So these were released earlier last year, and then the end of last year. And we expect them to be made final rules roughly the end of this year. The FAA is notorious a bit for those rules, dragging out sometimes for several years, but we're very hopeful that they will come out as final rules this year. What those do, though, is the operations over people rule establishes the safety requirement to fly over people, and does so in a way that doesn't that you don't have to gain case-by-case approval for it. Instead, if you meet the rule, you can go fly over it. And basically what it tells manufacturers is how the manufacturer has to design the aircraft and test the aircraft before it can be allowed to fly over people. Additionally, the remote ID rule or remote identification rule is the concept of people on the ground. It's the general public, law enforcement, public safety, you name it, being able to remotely identify the aircraft that is in the air. The way that you would do this with manned aviation is you have 1 foot tall letters on the side of the airplane, and you could visually look at it, read the number, and look it up. It's like a license plate. But drones are so small, there's really no way to do that. So how do you know that drone flying over your backyard or flying over the park or flying over the city is, who is it and why is it there? What's it doing? That's what remote ID is about. And I'm sure we'll get more into details of that. But the purpose there is not necessarily about separating from other aircraft. It's really about you on the ground understanding who that aircraft is in the air. But there's also several other rules that are currently in active development. We know of at least, I think, 3 more rules that we expect the FAA to release over the next several years. Those rules will help define more of the safety requirements. And the goal is that, in 3 to 4 years, we will hopefully be what we call operating by rule versus using waivers and exemptions to expand the initial FAA regulations that are out there so that aircraft can go and fly much more freely. And really what these rules do, as I mentioned here, they establish a clear benchmark for the technology to meet. So that's another major shift. We had no drone rules 5 years ago. Now we have multiple that should be final within the next year. So that's another major shift. And on public perception, so as I mentioned before, the public has been very anxious about this in the past because either it was a military connotation or it was some neighbor or someone else who had been flying around and perhaps they didn't know why they were flying around their yard. We, in our experience, as we rolled out a commercial drone delivery system here in the local community, we realized we certainly couldn't start just flying drones willy-nilly around the community, and people not panic or at least not be concerned about what was going on. So we wanted to make sure we talked to the community. So the picture here on the screen is actually from some public events that we did. There's all the construction equipment behind us because there was this was a touch-a-truck event. This is where kids could come out to the mall and try, getting big equipment and other things. But it was really just a community event or a festival type thing. We spent months doing exactly this, going to public venues. Obviously, this was pre-COVID, but going to public venues, including like the mall, we would set up a booth there and elsewhere, just so we could talk to the community. And what we found in, educating the community about what we were doing, listening to what they had to say, what their concerns were, and then responding to those and addressing those the best we could, is people learned more about the technology and about the value that it could bring to them. In this case, it was now they didn't have to put their kids in the car to go to the store to get something. It could come to them in 5 or 10 minutes. Their perception moved from concern to more of appreciation of the value that it brings to the industry, especially if we were able to address the privacy and safety concerns they had, which I think we did a pretty good job of doing, and I'm happy to answer questions on that later. So my talking point for this usually is we as an industry, as a drone industry, have to make sure that the interaction of drones with communities, the value that's perceived by them greatly exceeds any negatives. And I think the technology can absolutely bring that. And what we've found is now that we've had a drone package delivery system running in Christiansburg for almost a year, is that the community still loves the technology. They're still very positive about it, and the perception has been wonderful here locally. But we do still have some work to do, and so I don't want to ignore that. So let's talk about some of the remaining roadblocks that we're dealing with. So the biggest one, I think, and it has been since I started in this industry a decade ago, and it was probably a decade before that, or even before it was still the issue, is what we call detect and avoid. What that means is the ability of the pilot to avoid other aircraft. So this is really about the safety of the operation in the airspace. The way you would do this in manned aviation is you would have a pilot who would look out the window, visually see another airplane, and avoid it. We don't have a pilot on board the aircraft. And as it turns out, the human eye is an incredibly great sensor, and there's nothing else out there that's nearly as good as the human eye is. And so we've been working as an industry for the past, as I mentioned, 20 years probably, trying to develop technologies that can support this ability to detect and avoid other aircraft. The pictures on the screen represent two of these technologies, and I've already mentioned both of these previously. The one on the left is an airborne radar. It's a little small white panel on the drone the guys are carrying. The one on the right is a ground-based radar. Both are designed to do the same thing, to scan the airspace for other aircraft and then avoid it. Actually, it turns out that detecting it is only half the problem. Detecting it is hard, but then avoiding it and doing so reliably without endangering anybody else is also hard, especially if you think about flying, in more urban areas or near infrastructure like power lines or terrain like mountains. The system has to be able to know which way it can go to avoid the other aircraft while not jeopardizing someone else. This is a very, very, very difficult problem to solve, and there is no magic bullet yet. I think we're finding in our testing is that the technologies are improving, and they do work well for certain use cases, and we'll see certain use cases expand more quickly than others. We won't just jump straight to free flight everywhere. So that's detect and avoid. Perhaps the right behind that, though, this is one that's often overlooked as far as difficulty, is spectrum. And when I say spectrum, what I mean is a radio spectrum that we can use to communicate with the aircraft. In our industry, we call this command and control, or C2, the ability to command and control the aircraft, where it's going, to know where it is all the time, to reliably always be able to communicate with it. The problem with spectrum is that it's a finite resource, and everybody needs it. Your cell phones need it, your Wi-Fi systems need it, your laptops, the Internet of Things, the military, healthcare. Everybody needs spectrum. And for drones in particular, we need very clean, nobody else is using it, spectrum that we can use, transmit a long way. So it has to be real powerful. It's a pretty difficult use case here, and there are a number of activities ongoing to help set aside spectrum for drones. But because of that limited resource, because of all the regulatory pieces around this is what I believe is...
Mark, you're starting to fade out a little. You get closer to the mic, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hear me okay? Okay, my apologies. So spectrum is a big issue just because we can't get more of it. What we need requires a lot of regulation, and without it, though, we cannot enter this drone age. So I'll move on to the next one, though, because spectrum is not as exciting for most people. We also need the ability to routinely fly over people, and to do so, I mentioned before some of the understanding of the reliability of the aircraft or the safety if it were to hit you. The aircraft on the right here, this EB aircraft, is a 1.5 pound foam aircraft that basically bounces off of anything it hits, or it breaks apart. That's a good trait or a good feature, but what we need is the ability for many aircraft to be able to fly over people in the same way that a manned aircraft can fly over you. And so both of these aircraft in the picture have approvals to do so, but what we need is that more broadly. That's another big issue. And then the last issue, I've already spoken to this, is remote ID or remote identification. And the FAA and many others have said that this is the biggest hurdle in the near term, simply because the FAA will not consider approving broader operations until we can know who is flying where and when, and know that they're supposed to be there. For example, if we're flying over a stadium or somewhere else, that could be a legal operation, or it could be a not good operation. And we need to be able to have that ability to distinguish between the two, both from a safety perspective and from a security perspective. And so as new rules come out with this in the next few months, that will be the first block that we can put all these other pieces together under and build into what will become the drone age. So that's the end of my slides, and I think we're going to have some discussion here. So I'll just turn it back to you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Mark. It was very informative. I do have quite a few questions, and we're getting some questions from the audience that I'm also going to pass on to you. First of all, it was my understanding that the integration pilot program and the UAS test sites were tasked with figuring out a system for safely integrating commercial drones into the airspace. But at this point, they're going to require them to have the remote IDs so you know what's up there. But we really don't have a system for tracking drones. Can you tell us what the status of that is? And the disconnect seems to be they're already certifying major carriers like Amazon and UPS. So is this like the space program where we basically sublet it to the private sector and Amazon and UPS are going to figure out how to safely do this? Or are you developing something that will be across the board as opposed to case by case?
Thanks, Jack. Great question, big question. So let me approach it from a couple of angles. One, integration or integrating drones into the airspace is an incredibly complex topic. There's so many different aspects of that, and we've touched on many of them today. Certainly not all of them. The actually flying around with other aircraft, I think what you're getting at is really about managing the traffic in the airspace. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
Okay, so managing the traffic in the airspace and the congestion that might come or whatever else, there's a number of things that are happening there. Yes, commercial industry is driving much of this. The demand, and quite frankly, the demand comes from commercial industry. They're the users that want to use it. Without a demand signal, the FAA is not going to take action on it ever. But because of that industry demand, you mentioned UPS and Amazon and Wing and others, there's hundreds of other companies to be listed. That demand is what drives change. So as far as managing the traffic in the skies, there's two aspects. One is managing that with other manned aircraft, and then managing that with drone to drone. So they're different risks. A drone hits another drone, the risk is very different than if a drone hits an airplane. Obviously, we don't want either one, but hitting a manned airplane would be much, much, much worse. Obviously, the chance of the loss of life is much higher if we hit a manned aircraft. And so, to date, most of this has been happening visual line of sight. But as we go beyond visual line of sight, we have to be able to, as we said, detect and avoid the other aircraft. Now, most manned aircraft are transmitting a signal on a transponder. There's different technologies. We won't have to get into the details of those, but they're transmitting a signal out. That we've raised the idea years ago of drones transmitting the same signal out so that everybody can avoid each other. The problem is that those systems that are part of the national airspace system are not designed to handle 1 million aircraft in the air at one time or 500,000 aircraft in the air at one time. They currently have to handle 8,000 to 10,000 aircraft in the air at the same time. And so there's been a lot of analysis done to show that quite simply the system could not handle it if all drones and all manned airplanes all the time transmitted on the same transponder frequencies. So one of the ways we're addressing this is that the drone can receive the signal from manned aircraft and not transmit anything, but receive it and self-avoid the other aircraft. So you can receive that in and then maneuver to avoid the manned aircraft. That's one way. Another is, as I mentioned, radars and other sensors we fly on board that will detect and avoid the other aircraft. But then there's also the drone-to-drone thing still going on because the other drones aren't transmitting. And the main concept that's being discussed there and researched, including here at Virginia Tech, is UAS traffic management, or UTM, which is the concept of basically software automatically separating the aircraft. So each of the drones are communicating with a software that talks to the other drones, and they can see where all the other aircraft are that are flying near them. And then
Okay, Mark, excuse me. these are concepts, right?
These are, well, they're things that are in active test. So we are testing that very thing actually this month or in October.
Okay, but what I'm trying to understand is you're running an FAA certified program, and there are several others around the country, and a system of tracking drones and making sure it's safe to fly them in the airspace is under development. But at the same time, UPS and Amazon have been certified as carriers.
Mm-hmm.
So do they have their own tracking system, or as far as you know, are their flights going to be limited to certain routes and altitudes, or have we basically subcontracted the IPP program to Amazon and UPS?
So the way that most of these companies are handling this is a kind of a crawl stage or an interim stage. They are using what we call visual observers. So they use people on the ground to visually observe the airspace around them. So they may be flying beyond line of sight of the pilot, but they can put, another visual observer in another location who can also see the aircraft or see the airspace around it. And so they will use people on the ground. That's kind of been the Band-Aid solution we're using right now, of people on the ground visually observing the airspace to keep traffic separated. So all of these companies have a risk mitigation, or they have a method of doing so. And the one that everybody appears to be using right now is visual observers, while they test their sensors or their other equipment that will someday replace the need for the observers on the ground.
Well, it's fascinating. We were discussing before the presentation the experience with the autonomous motor vehicles, and how the automakers just a couple of years ago were saying they were going to go directly to what they call stage 5 autonomy in cars, to driverless cars. And then they discovered that unless you take the drivers out of all of the cars and put sensors in them, it's really not safe to do that. But it seems like the government is moving full steam ahead. As a pilot, do you believe that drone operators, as well as the equipment itself, needs to be held to the same level of certification as we have in commercial aviation today? And the other part of that question is, if you do feel that it has to be as strict as somebody, taking off in a 747, is that going to slow down the introduction of commercial drones?
Yeah, so great question. I believe that drones share many similar aspects of other manned aviation, but they are unique. And so the training and the certification required for drones should probably reflect the unique nature of the systems. And does a pilot flying a 747 with hundreds of people on board need the same level of certification as someone flying a 5-pound foam drone? I don't think that would seem to be appropriate, but there does need to be a level of certification and training requirements that are appropriate and commensurate to the risk involved in the operation. So that I don't think it's a one size fits all. I see as the operations become more complex, the training and the certification of the operator has to also become more complex. But I do believe in that certification, that that they are reviewed and they are trained and they test, and that is a good thing to do. Right now, Part 107, all you have to do is take a written test. You don't have to actually go fly anything. But if you want to go anywhere beyond just visual line of sight, you're probably going to have more training than just a written test. And that's been the case for all the people that we've worked with that have gained case-by-case approvals to do so.
But the training implies a certification process, right?
Yeah, so the certification, the actual stamp of certification from the FAA, for example, there's some limitations on what's currently out there, because that's a rulemaking activity. Is because right now the only licenses the FAA can issue are manned aviation licenses, like a private pilot or an instrument rating pilot or a commercial pilot. And then there's also a remote pilot certificate, which is the one that's just a written test. There's not currently an in between there. So what we're seeing is either that for more complex operations, the FAA is requiring you to either be a manned pilot and have that higher level of certification, or to be a remote pilot plus additional training from a third party typically. So that's actually another area of rulemaking is what are the other licenses or certifications in between the 747 pilot and the drone pilot that currently exist.
All right, Mark, let's take some questions from our audience. David Reynolds would like to know, do drones now make use of current onboard airspace data in the same way that commercial pilots do?
So there are systems that I guess on board in this case depends on how you view on board. On board could be the aircraft itself seeing and detecting other aircraft, making decisions, or it could be the pilot sitting in the cockpit on the ground. So so yes, both of those are true. We have instances where the aircraft is able to see other air traffic and make maneuvers all by itself. We also have cases where pilots on the ground receive a feed of data showing other aircraft. But what we don't have is there's some of the specific technologies that manned aircraft have, which is TCAS, which is traffic collision avoidance system. We don't have that for drones. It's not been certified for use on drones, but we do have very similar things that can provide similar data.
Now, with any remote control system, cybersecurity is going to be a big concern. We certainly don't want people hacking into drones while they're being operated remotely. Do you feel that the industry, or can you tell us that the industry is developing cybersecurity resources that are going to be needed for wide-scale commercial use of UAS?
Yeah, so cybersecurity is definitely a major concern, and it's one that's been addressed quite a bit, and will continue, I think, to raise in priority. When there's one-off drone operations happen every once in a while, it's not as big of a concern because there's quite frankly not as many opportunities for cyber intrusion. But when there's more and more flying, then obviously the greater chance of that. So there's a couple of different pieces to it, or actually a lot of pieces to it. But one is protecting the link to the aircraft. I spoke to Spectrum before. Just you don't even want to lose control of the aircraft. You get somebody to jam it or somebody to somehow break that link, so you can't talk to it. That's one thing we have to protect against, and that's part of having protected spectrum for the aircraft. But the other part is being able to get into the drone, control it, and make it do what they want it to do, and that's even another higher level. And so all the companies that we've worked with have significant cyber either products already developed or in significant development. They're addressing this actively. I think this is actually part of the certification process for current aircraft that are trying to be type certified, is understanding what is the encryption, what is the cyber protection, what are all the ways you're addressing cybersecurity. And we do have a team at Virginia Tech, not part of my team, but another team at Virginia Tech that is looking very closely and doing a lot of research on cybersecurity for drones. And we don't want to minimize that because we certainly want to protect them.
Now, many of the people in our audience are economic developers and site selectors, and they're looking at drones as a tool to create virtual site tours, to, for example, show people all of the parcels that are available in industrial park. Now, you've explained how the regulation is from the 107 rules were really aimed at hobbyists and I'm sorry?
You broke up there some.
Can you hear me?
I've got you now.
Okay. for people who don't want to create a commercial operation but have a specific use for drones, like a virtual site tour of an industrial park or a port, do they have to go through a complicated certification process now, or are the rules flexible enough to expand the use of drones in that sector?
So under Part 107, that initial commercial rule, as long as you're flying visual line of sight, then it's pretty flexible what you can do with it, as long as you're not flying over people also. So that's the written test, and you can do many real estate and other activities. And in fact, there's a lot of things you can do with that limitation of visual line of sight. But yeah, as soon as you want to go fly long distance somewhere, that's going to open up a whole new can of worms that really nobody has solved. We have, I guess, incremental steps of gaining additional approvals, but all those are quite complex. So it's a dramatic transition when you want to go from visual line of sight to beyond line of sight, and that will probably be the case for quite some time. Does that answer the question, Jack?
Well, I think what you're saying is that it's not that complicated a process, that these applications are approved at this point. Am I correct in assuming that?
For Part 107,
if an organization wanted to send a drone up and take a virtual, film a virtual site tour, they don't need federal approval for that.
They would need, since it's furthering a business, or they consider that to be commercial or higher, they would need to be under Part 107. So they would need to be a Part 107 pilot, which is a written test. But once you have the written test, there are some other rules. It depends on the airspace you're in. It's part of the testing that you have to go through. But given that you can comply with the airspace and take a written test, then yes, you can go do real estate. You can do site tours. You can do all those things as long as you're complying with that current rule.
We did have a question here relating to our discussion of cybersecurity. David wants to know if cybersecurity of uplink and downlink data is an important or emerging sector opportunity. What would you say to that?
I would say that uplink and downlink, that's basically data going to the aircraft or data coming from the aircraft. Both of those are important. We want to protect both of them. The main concern, at least from our perspective of safety and the operation, is being able to continue to communicate with the aircraft. If you don't have downlink data, you don't know where the aircraft is at, and so you don't know if your commands are being received. If you don't have uplink data, you might know where the aircraft is at, but you can't tell it to do something else. So part of it depends on how autonomous that aircraft is. If the aircraft is like basically truly autonomous, or doesn't need input from the pilot, then the link becomes less critical. But the FAA, quite frankly, doesn't know how to certify autonomy on board an aircraft very well yet. So at least currently, the uplink and downlink both need to be protected. And I would just say yes, that cybersecurity is important, both sides.
Well, Mark, I've got a question for you from another pilot, and his name is also Mark. And Mark Weiss says, as a pilot, I want to get this word right, no turns for UAS operations at or very close. NOTAMs, I'm sorry. NOTAMs for UAS operations at or very close to airports that I need to use. I have the information, but no indication as to what I am to do to improve safety operations in or near these areas. Any suggestions? And we certainly hope that Mark is not in a cockpit right now, but
yeah, so NOTAMs are notices to airmen. So that's where it's just a tool for we can submit a notice out there, say, hey, we're flying in this area. They are not mandatory information, so it doesn't reserve an airspace for someone. It just notifies them. I would say if you want to improve the safety there, first of all, the drone pilot's responsibility to stay out of your way. The drone pilot has to give way and has to yield to the manned aircraft. But if you want to improve that communication, I highly recommend that you talk to the person that issued the NOTAM. The NOTAMs are, usually have a name or number attached to them. And, there was a very bad practice probably about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe it still is ongoing in some places, where people would put up these notices that, hey, we're going to be flying this area, and it would be a really large area. It would last for months or years, and you didn't really mean anything to you as a pilot. And thankfully, the FAA has pushed back on that to make these much more limited and geographically defined and temporary in nature for when they're actually operating. But the best thing would be to communicate either with the person that issued the NOTAM or with the local airport, because they might know more. What we have found in our experience is that, when we talk to pilots, when they reached out to us, we've been able to explain exactly what we're doing, what our aircraft looks like, what our altitudes are, when we'll be flying, and it really helps them to understand what they need to do to increase safety even more. But at the end of the day, the liability and the responsibility is on us as a pilot of the drone, and want to make sure that's clear too.
Yeah, but your identifier just identifies the equipment. Pilot could be anybody. You could be in a room in Vegas somewhere, right?
Well, what he's talking about there is a notice that's submitted through the FAA system, and so when we submit a notice, what we'll say is we're going to.
I guess what I'm driving at here is that this isn't like two pilots flying commercial jets who are communicating through an air traffic controller. This is a signal from a machine, and you're hoping there's a certified operator behind it, and there's really no way to communicate with that machine. And I think what our friend Mark is telling us is there's no guidance on what to do when they tell you it's closing in on your airspace.
So the tool that he was referencing, the NOTAM, the Notices to Airmen, is not a digital signal. It's literally basically it's an advisory that a pilot will send to air traffic control, and air traffic control will relay that to other people, and it's for a certain amount of time and space. So it's like, we're going to be doing drone operations, 2 miles from the Blacksburg airport from this date to this date. It's not saying that the aircraft is encroaching on you. So there's no digital signal happening between the two.
All right. In your opinion, Mark, and obviously this is, with all new technologies, there's sort of a discovery phase, and I'm old enough to remember when cars didn't have headrests or airbags, so we're not minimizing the challenge here, but just your general opinion. How rapidly can we scale up commercial drone systems, or do you think it's not going to be case by case? Certainly, everybody's going to be looking to see what Amazon and UPS actually do with this certification they've been given. But just in general, people were talking about a $70 billion industry growing around UAS. Do you still see that potential in that kind of a time frame?
Yeah, so the economic impact of drones and the forecasts of huge markets have all, I think, far exceeded what the reality has been, largely because it's a very heavily regulated industry, and the ability to do all the things that drones can do is not possible yet. What I do see happening is I see new rulemaking and new technology breakthroughs causing kind of a stair-step effect of jumps in the market and the growth of the technology, but I don't see the door ever just opening and suddenly there's a huge floodgate that grows, in these unreasonable time frames of like 2, 3, 4 years to these massive scales. And really, early on, a lot was hype. Everybody had to have a drone program. Everybody had to do this, and you've seen now this kind of taper back off some to those that have really found what are the very valuable uses. It's not a solution for everything. It's a tool in the toolbox that can benefit many industries, but it doesn't solve everything. But if we look at around the world, look at the globe, though. There are other countries that are not as regulated or moving much quicker than the U.S. is as far as commercial operations, and they are not scaling as fast as even advertised there. So I think it's probably a little less than some of the forecasts have said.
Mark, could you, one of our viewers noticed, could you put the slide with your contact information back up on the screen? And so just to summarize it, well, actually, there was one other question I wanted to ask you. The frequency bandwidth, you mentioned spectrum as one of the issues. Is there enough bandwidth to handle thousands of these remote IDs?
So those are two separate issues potentially. Well, they're not, but not unlinked. So remote ID, first of all, there's two concepts for remote ID. One is the aircraft is transmitting some kind of signal, like you're talking about, or the other is it's simply network to the internet. We call these broadcast and network. So if the aircraft is just, basically the ground control station, whoever's controlling the aircraft, is connected to the internet and transmitting this information to an app or whatever you pull up on your phone, that doesn't take any more bandwidth than we're already using for the internet. So really, it's just the broadcast question. And the requirements of remote ID are to broadcast certain distances. It's not tremendous distances. And so I don't foresee this being a huge issue because that's broadcast over Bluetooth or other, I think it's Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. So that's still unlicensed band. It's using the same technology that you use for your phone in a lot of ways. It's Bluetooth 4.0 or better. I think we can use that without the interference problems. There's a bigger question about spectrum and whether or not there's enough bandwidth for command and control long term. But for remote ID, I don't think it will be an issue with the current proposed technologies.
Okay, we're coming up to a time limit, so this will be my last question for you. And when we were discussing before the presentation, we're talking about, there seem to be two camps in terms of how widely we're going to permit drones to fly. There's the corridor approach, and then there's let them fly everywhere under a certain set of rules. What I'm wondering is, do individuals have any privacy rights? If I don't want UPS to send a drone over my house, can I stop it?
So there's probably a couple of questions in there. One, first of all, the airspace is regulated by the FAA. It's regulated at the federal level, not the local level. And so there's obviously a lot of discussion about this, especially the extremely low altitude. As you get down into, at what point does the local, either the local individual or a locality, have control of the space around it? And that's certainly a hot debate. But for the commercial use of drones, and UPS flying over or anybody else, those are flying up, at a high enough altitude that the FAA says we have control of that airspace. There are, as far as privacy concerns go, yes, certainly have an expectation of privacy. It should be protected from any form of intrusion, if it's from a drone or if it's from somebody flying around in a helicopter with binoculars or whatever else it might be. It's still an expectation of privacy still has that, and that doesn't go away or change with the technology. The idea of corridors, and necessarily there's a lot in that question. There's been proposals, various different proposals of ways to handle this. You could have highways in the sky. You can have drone corridors between two cities. They always fly along the same route. But let's just think about this. If we had the highways in the sky problem, this is one of the concerns that I have with that concept is, so you make every drone fly, certain routes. What that does is that puts all of that traffic, all that noise, whatever, everything associated with it over that very narrow, small area. And now that population is exposed. And even if it's over a highway, now that all the people driving or, have aircraft flying over them and the neighborhoods around them are exposed to 100% of the traffic versus distributing this across, the entire area. And Wing, a partner we've worked with a lot in their package delivery, made the conscious decision to basically randomize their routes so that they never go just point A to B straight. They go random routes to any 2 points.
I know people who drive that way.
True. But the idea is that you don't put all that burden on some select population. You spread it out, and yet you bring value to everyone. And so I'm much more in favor of the latter.
Well, Mark, we've exhausted our time. I want to thank you for a really informative and interesting discussion. There are a lot of questions and a lot of challenges to be met. A recording of this webinar will be available on the businessfacilities.com website. And for anybody who is registered to attend next week's virtual LiveXchange event, there will also be an on-demand recording available on the LiveXchange event site during the event from September 28th to September 30th. I want to invite everyone to join us for our next Business Facilities LiveXchange webinar. That will be tomorrow, Wednesday, September 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll be discussing the labor market in a remote economy with Josh Wright of MC. So we look forward to everybody joining us there, and thank you for joining us today, and have a good afternoon.